Thanks again for the honor of being here, and we're excited about today. Logistically, easy stuff. The restrooms are just outside and to your right and downstairs. It's adult learning, so go to town as you see fit throughout the day. There is a tradition sometimes at these gatherings of, normally it's Carl Cannon who leads a little walk on the Tuesday morning, and tomorrow, kindly, Adele and Miranda have offered to lead that walk. If you just meet them, if you want to go, sunrise is like at 7:25 exactly, so it's lovely. The sun comes up and then bursts over that sort of 7 to 7:45 or so hour pre-breakfast. If you want to go, you can meet them at the foot of the pathway leading out to the beach, the only one that the hotel has by the gate, and they'll be there at 7 o'clock sharp. So if you wish, that's partly because these things are supposed to be a bit of a retreat, a bit of a getaway, and then get back to work. And today's session with Nick, Christoph, and Sul Chan should hopefully remind us of like the ideals of journalism. The book, he says, is kind of like a love letter to journalism. It's a memoir that will be out May 14th. So we're going to hear a little bit about that and about his sort of big think reflections on the craft and on a life over the last 40 years at the New York Times. So Nick has been at the New York Times since 1984, almost continuously, as most of you know. He has looked to sort of say in his columns some things that others may overlook sometimes, like Darfur, or the fact that there are 100 million girls not born in China or India. And although the book is 460 pages, it kind of reads like a movie. It's fast-paced, it's engaging, it's funny, and I hope we'll get a window. He has a father who was rescued after World War II by the French diplomat Robert Morisset, who didn't need to do it, but had the power to do it, and did so, and brought his family from roots in Armenia and Poland, maybe even a little bit Ukraine, to Ellis Island. Eventually they settle in Oregon. The book, talks about how like Nick has a grandmother, maternal grandmother called Mary Shakespeare, and she had a cousin named William, and the guy has a traffic accident, goes to the hospital, wakes up in the hospital room one morning and says his name to the nurse, and she says, there, boy, why don't you get a little more rest? And we'll talk a little bit later. He becomes a Rhodes Scholar because he read a book as a kid that said that many Rhodes Scholars became foreign correspondents, and he wanted to be one, so that was the path. He made the cross-country team in his small school in Oregon, evidently because he could breathe. He sees a fight with a kid, he ducks away and says, I wish it was because of my deep-seated convictions about pacifism, but really I was just afraid that Chris was going to beat the hell out of me. He sort of begins noticing differences in class and sort of habits and family structure. We'll talk about tomorrow. Growing up in Oregon, he goes to Harvard, and he goes to the stacks in the library, Widener Library, and he pulls down, maybe as a sophomore, I can't remember, a book that has, it's a who's who of America. And he checks to see if his father has an entry in the book, and it does, and I want to read it to you. His dad says, post-World War II, war, want, and concentration camps, exile from home and homeland, these have made me hate strife among men, but they have not made me lose faith in the future of mankind. Personal experience, including my own unsteady progress through life, has taught me to beware of man's capacity for plain, stupid, irrational, as well as consciously evil behavior. But it also taught me that man has an even greater capacity for recovery from lapses. In short, I remain a rationalist and an optimist at a time when the prophets of doom have the floor. My query is, if man has been able to create the arts, the sciences, and material civilization that we know in America, why should he be judged powerless to create justice, fraternity, and peace? It's a book like that, okay? And I don't have time to talk about habits he learned from Bob Woodward about sourcing, or his friendship with David Sanger, who became his best man, or his sort of sessions with Isaiah Berlin. They gather at Oxford, and he sort of dazzles the group with his wisdom and his sort of intellectual humility and his brilliance, but there's a lot of learning. Oh, and the fact that he beats out this Morgan Stanley banker while chasing Cheryl, his now wife. The guy's handsome, he's got a BMW, and nope, Nick gets engaged to Cheryl at an active
homicide.
Yes. So, okay, you've got his bio in your package. Let me just hit quick highlights. 2-time Pulitzer winner, one with his wife Cheryl, best-selling author since 1984, has been at the New York Times, foreign correspondent, as a bureau chief, as a reporter, and now as a columnist. He's been reporting from a lot of different places, as described more in your program. Sul Chan, who will respond to Nick and really draw him out a little bit more in conversation, which is why we're sitting as we are, joined the Texas Tribune in October of 2021, previously as a deputy managing editor, and then the editorial page editor of the Los Angeles Times, so he overlapped with Jackie there. His team was awarded a Pulitzer for editorial writing in 2021. He overlapped with Nick at the New York Times from 2004 to 2018, so former colleagues as well. He worked there as a Metro reporter, a Washington correspondent, a deputy op-ed editor, an international news editor. Began at the Post. He was the first in his family to go to college, first at Harvard, then at Oxford as a Marshall Scholar, incredibly active at the intersection of philanthropy and journalism, and you can read all about some of the boards he serves on in your program. So again, Nick's going to talk about his book, about 25 minutes or so. Sul's going to draw him out a little bit more, and then over to you. We'll take a little break at 10:30. If you've got a question and you know it, maybe just use your table tent. We'll add to the queue. Nick Kristof, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. A lot of you are veterans here. I'm a total newbie, but thrilled to be here. Worked with Sul before. A number of you I've interacted with at various places at various times. It was appropriate, actually, that Josh mentioned my dad's quotation, because I think in some ways my memoir talks about the degree to which I've had a headache for editors over the years. Even when I was an editor, I was a headache for editors above that. And that was partly because I was trying to kind of figure out what lines and what was appropriate and not, and sometimes testing those lines. I mean, running for governor was a pretty good test of those lines, too. And I think one of the influences in that desire to test those lines was what my dad had gone through and my family. Basically, the family was Armenians living in northern Bukovina, which between the wars was Romania, is now southern Ukraine. A number of Ukraine experts here. And then the family was secretly spying on the Nazis in a spy ring in Poland, getting information out, radioing it to Bucharest. The family got caught, and many long upheavals and adventures. My dad ended up in a concentration camp in Yugoslavia, and this French diplomat really broke all the rules to save my dad's life. And this diplomat never became an ambassador, and I had the sense that his career suffered because he was breaking rules. But in my family, he was kind of God. And then that enabled my dad to get to France. He thought that a East European refugee would never really be fully accepted, nor his yet unborn children fully accepted in French society. And so he began to think about going to the US. He tried to arrange a fake marriage with an American citizen. That fell apart. And then he was able to get an American visa, in part because two journalists kind of went out on a limb and encouraged the American ambassador to give him a visa. And I think about that and the propriety of that. Should a journalist really be telling an ambassador who to give a visa to? I mean, it seems kind of dubious. On the other hand, that's why I exist. And so I've sometimes thought about my obligations to others in those contexts. Another crucial formative influence was growing up in this really tiny small town in rural Oregon, Yamhill, which was traditionally dependent on timber, agriculture, and light manufacturing, very much a working class community. And it had done pretty well for much of the 20th century. There'd been a lot of upward mobility with the timber industry. The kids who were closest to me, who I walked to the school bus with every day, their dad worked in the sawmill. My other good friend Billy, his dad was a truck driver. The kids who got on the bus right after me each morning were the 5 Knapp kids, whose dad had a job laying sewer pipe, and the mom had a job driving tractor. And I think growing up in this small town made me kind of sensitive to other sort of small towns around the world. It's one reason why when I go to a capital, I try to get out of that capital very quickly. And also, increasingly, we had a sense that, there was incredible dysfunction in this town. And there was a sense that policymakers were completely ignoring the crisis in places like Yamhill. And that later was to very much affect my reporting. So I was hired by the Times in 1984 by Abe Rosenthal, kind of by accident and kind of by the Good Old Boy Network. David Sanger had been a college friend. The Washington Post, that I had interned twice for the Washington Post. The Washington Post had always said, "Oh, we'll hire you whenever you finish your education." Then I got to Washington to be hired, and my girlfriend was hired, but not me. And this was traumatic in every possible way. And so then I decided to go to Tunisia to be a stringer. I stop off in New York on the way to Tunisia, and Abe Rosenthal ends up hiring me as a reporter at the Times. And then go out to Los Angeles as a business correspondent. There I have this conflict with this Morgan Stanley guy. I managed to win Cheryl. And then we, partly because Asia didn't really matter in the 1980s, so the Times was willing to send me as a foreign correspondent to Asia, to this little backwoods in Hong Kong and later Beijing. And one of the things that that really struck me when I was writing about this period is just how the Times, the degree to which the Times at that point was truly incredibly misogynistic and homophobic and about as non-diverse as you can possibly imagine. One example, when I was a young reporter, one woman working for the paper, in the cover of her personnel file, her official personnel file in the Times, a manager had scrawled "great tits." This is on her official personnel file. And obviously this was something that women faced much more directly, but it was also an issue for men because the Times made it kind of impossible for spouses to work for the Times for foreign correspondence. And the Times had just fired a reporter whom some of you may know, David Tribbin, because David was an incredible reporter at the Times, and Abe Rosenthal wanted to send him off to be a foreign correspondent in Nairobi or Hong Kong. And David said, "Well, that's great, but my wife works for U.S. News and World Report. She's not portable." And so the Times fired David because he wanted to respect the fact that his wife had a career. And then the Times, to its credit, then later under Max Frankel, then they sent Cheryl and me to Beijing, and we were an experiment as the first couple of foreign correspondents. And we thought it worked brilliantly. I'm not sure that was universally viewed, but it was an incredible privilege for the two of us to be covering China then in 1988 to 93. We were there during Tiananmen, and I was on Tiananmen Square when the troops opened fire on June 4th, 1989. And something you just never quite recover from, seeing a modern army roll up and open fire with automatic weapons on a crowd of unarmed students and workers. And one of the things that left a particularly deep impression on me that evening was in covering the democracy movement, I'd often been kind of scornful of the peasants and the workers and made the point that they would call for democracy, but that they couldn't really define democracy, didn't really know exactly what they wanted. For a lot of them, it was really about ending corruption or reducing inflation, and they talked about democracy, but what did that really mean? And so there was a certain amount of, I think, scorn in my coverage of some of that constituency. And then that night, when the troops opened fire, the real heroes were these rickshaw drivers who were these completely uneducated peasants. And whenever there was a lull in the firing, they would drive out toward the troops and pick up the bodies of the kids who'd been killed or injured, put them on the backs of the rickshaws and rush them to the hospitals. And it was this display of raw courage that I've rarely seen equal and never surpassed. And it struck me that these guys might not have been able to define democracy, but they were willing to die for it. And that left a deep impression on me. Covering that period of massacres, and then afterward, we had friends thrown in prison. We were being tailed every time we left our compound. That maybe began to be when I began to test some of these limits. And in particular, one of the big tests came when there was a young man called Liu Xiang, and we write about this. He had helped us cover Tiananmen at his university. He was a physics student at Tsinghua University, and he helped us cover the democracy movement at Tsinghua. He had once registered us at the gate to get us into the campus. After the crackdown, he got in trouble for that, and he ended up being arrested. He escaped from prison, and he came to Beijing and asked me for help fleeing China. What do? The pretty basic rule of foreign correspondence: you don't help an escaped fugitive flee the country. On the other hand, here's a 19-year-old kid who, if we didn't help him, look, at some point he's going to be caught. And God only knows what would happen to him if he was caught. And he had gotten in trouble because he was helping New York Times readers, because he'd helped us. And so I kind of agonized over our responsibilities. I couldn't consult with New York, both because our phone lines were obviously tapped, but also because no editor in their right mind can possibly say, yeah, Nick, go ahead and help an escaped fugitive. We would be risking, if we were caught, Cheryl and I would be kicked out of the country, the Times Bureau might be closed. And so Cheryl was then, the Chinese had taken away her press credentials, so she was off reporting in Australia, and I waited for her to come back. I couldn't make this decision on my own, and we went on these long walks talking about what we should do. And Cheryl, to her great credit, said, look, he's 19. If we don't help, he's going to be arrested. He'll be in prison forever, and that's the best case scenario. And we've got to help him. And I mean, the other thing, frankly, that I was going through the back of my mind was, look, I'd never heard of somebody escaping from a Chinese prison. It just seemed pretty far-fetched. I wondered if this was some kind of an entrapment effort. We'd help him, and then state security would kind of rush in, and it would all be on film, but we did help him, and state security did not film it. He was able to cross into Hong Kong. I flew to Hong Kong the next day. We were able to get him to the US. He's now in the US. And it was one of the least professional things, maybe the most unprofessional thing I've ever done at the Times, but profoundly satisfying, totally the right thing to do, I think. And I must say that because it succeeded, and we didn't get caught, and I didn't get kicked out, and the bureau wasn't closed, the Times, afterward, I completely came clean, and the Times was all happy with it and delighted. Good thing you did that, and it turned out that in 1959, the Times, well, in the form of a Rosenthal, had helped a Polish stringer for the Times escape to Western Europe, and so they told me, oh, you're in a fine tradition. And I knew that if this had gone differently, then the attitudes might have been rather different as well. After a time in Japan, then I'd been resisting the idea of editing, and then Joe Lelyveld, who had been very much a mentor, he brought me back to, he kept offering better and better editing assignments to try to lure me into editing, and finally offered me the job of editing the weekend paper, including the Sunday Times, and that was just too good to pass. So I was an editor for a while in 2000 and 2001, and then Joe Lelyveld stepped down, Howell Raines came in as the new executive editor, and we collided almost immediately and butted heads. And so I found my escape route to the opinion world. And so that's how I ended up being a columnist. And I think when I got my column, my assumption was, oh, I'm going to be, writing twice a week about things and changing minds all across America. It was kind of fascinating that I quickly realized that whenever I write about issues that people have actually thought about, if I write about politics or abortion or the Middle East or whatever, you don't really change anybody's mind. And people who start out agreeing with you think, oh, great column, Nick. And people who start out disagreeing with you say, Christoph completely missed the boat again today. But it did seem to me that where we have a chance to change, to really have an impact, is not, well, actually, there's one exception to that. If I, as somebody who is typically fairly liberal, if I take a conservative position on some issue, then liberals will hear me out in a way that is not true if a conservative made the same argument. And so I disproportionately, when I do disagree with my fellow liberals, I'm more likely to write that column because I know that that is actually a case where I may change some minds here and there at the margin, although pissing off every other reader of mine. But really, I think the main way that we have impact is our ability to project issues on the agenda. I think that's true of both reporters and columnists. It's that ability to make people read something and maybe spill their coffee because they've read it. And that's how I got engaged in various other issues that tested editors. As a reporter really beginning as a reporter, I'd been really struck by gender issues, gender inequity, and part of that was in China, that we wrote so much about Tiananmen, and we don't know, but maybe 400 to 800 people were killed at Tiananmen. And meanwhile, I came across about that same time of a study that every year, just among infants in China, 30,000 were dying each year because girls, because they didn't have the same access to food and healthcare as boys. Overall, 100 million women were missing in Asia because of gender inequity. And I thought, we never write a word about this kind of scale, and then I did a piece about what we would now call sex trafficking in Cambodia, and it just blew me away that there were these, I mean, it felt like a 19th century slave auction. There were these young girls who'd been kidnapped from their villages, and they were being sold for their virginity. And if they tried to escape, the police would grab them and send them right back to the brothel. And it left a profound impression on me, the scale of it and the brutality of it. And so then, as a columnist, I began to write more about some of these gender issues, including trafficking. And then in 2004, caused more headaches for our lawyers and my editors when in Cambodia ended up buying 2 girls from their brothels. One paid $150 for one, and I think it was $300 for the other. And at one level, this is an awful policy. The last thing you want to be doing is buying people, because then you're increasing demand and raising prices and creating incentives for, traffickers to kidnap other girls from the villages. On the other hand, it's a quite effective way to put human faces on the issue. And the results were mixed in those 2 cases. One had only been in the brothel for, both were teenagers, young teenagers. One ended up, she'd only been in the brothel for a few weeks. She went back home. People didn't know about her background. Things kind of worked out pretty well. The other had become addicted to meth in the brothels, which is a good way of controlling girls. And we brought her back to her parents, and there was great joy. And then, I forget, 4 or 5 days later, she ran back to the brothel to get the meth. And then since we dealt with her, we went back and worked with her a number of times. She ended up actually, the brothels in that town ended up actually being closed down, and she ended up marrying the local police officer who'd been a customer. And I think it's partly because if you were in rural Cambodia and you want a supply of meth, then a police officer is a pretty good source of meth, the way things work in rural Cambodia. The other issue that really left a big impression was Darfur. Spent a lot of time reporting that, and that just really, truly seared me. Again, you never quite recover from seeing these villages burned down and putting inevitably, as a reporter, you're not only taking risks for yourself, but you're also putting your interpreter at risk, your driver, if you're with a photographer. And I found that really hard. I mean, at one, once in Darfur, we got our 19-year-old interpreter. Yeah, we were arrested with him, and we were then held in this cell decorated with a mural of a man lying down being impaled through his stomach. And fundamentally, I had value as a white American, a guy with a blue passport, that I had ransom value. My interpreter had no value, and he would just be shot. And he, in fact, we did end up getting released, but I came to think there and during the Iraq War that in general journalists take too many risks and aren't careful enough. And I sort of contrasted with the military, which is in the business of taking risks, and I think does a much better job of actually managing those risks and trying to keep people careful. The Times and everybody has gotten much, much better at this, but I think we still have more to do. Let me bounce on quickly to my departure from journalism in 2001. bounced into politics. I had a 10-minute political career running for governor in Oregon. And that was just fascinating because I'd been so close to politics for so long, and I kind of thought I knew it at covering it. And it just turned out to be so different on the other side. And the one thing that my team and I all thought, well, you know, Christoph may not know all this other stuff, but at least he'll be good with reporters. He'll be great at press conferences. You know, the one thing I completely screwed up was meetings with reporters, basically because I would answer questions. And you know, people would put me on the spot and ask them a difficult question, and I would make this good faith effort to respond. And my team would be like aghast. Why did you answer that question? and so then they gave me, you know, major lessons in evading questions. And I got better at evading questions and answering the question that I wished I'd been asked. But and you know, I started off thinking that politics is pretty dysfunctional. I left thinking that politics is, wow, more dysfunctional than I had imagined. And especially the campaign finance side of it. And you know, part of what drove me there was indeed what was happening in my little town. That I'd come back from humanitarian crises abroad, and there was a humanitarian crisis in my little town. And basically what happened was jobs went away, and meth arrived, and people self-medicated. Men then got criminal records. They became less employable, less marriageable. The social structure just completely fell apart. And so I mentioned the kids who I walked to school with each day. The older one, Bobby, raped his girlfriend's daughter and was serving a life sentence in Colorado. His brother, Mike, died while homeless in the streets of the nearby town. And Billy, the kid whose dad was a truck driver, he spent 20 years in state prison and for brutally beating a shopkeeper. He died last October. And the 5 Knapp kids who I went to school with each, who got on the bus right after me each morning, the Farland, the oldest, who was my classmate, he died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. His brother Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. His brother Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Their sister Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use. And their baby brother Keelan died right at the beginning of the pandemic of an overdose, probably fentanyl. And you know, 5 kids dying just one after the other. I don't know, it felt that we in journalism had not paid adequate attention to those kinds of issues in working class America, that politicians hadn't. I spent a lot of time covering Afghanistan and Iraq and deeply believed in covering those stories, but did the math at one point and we were losing more Americans to drugs, alcohol, and suicide every 2.5 weeks than we'd lost in 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't want to end on that note because that's a little grim. The title is actually Chasing Hope, and it's really and it's
emphasis on the chasing.
It's also an argument that journalism can be an anecdote to address these kinds of dysfunction, in part about what we cover, that journalism is an act of hope, because when you go out and take risks and cover really difficult things, then it's because you believe that you can actually engineer some change at the margins. And I've seen that. And journalism can imperfectly, incompletely bring about real change. And I think we've all seen that. And I do also worry that sometimes our coverage, that because we cover planes that crash, not planes that take off, there's just an inevitable bias toward bad news. And we cover what happens on a particular day. Events are often bad events. Trends are often good trends. I periodically make my standard argument that, which nobody in the world agrees with me on, but that this is the best time to be alive since humans emerged, 250,000 years ago. And I make that argument really based on kind of what I've seen, especially in the developing world. And one of the basic metrics of well-being is how likely your kids are to die. Historically, almost half of all kids died as children. Now we're below 4%. 2023 was the lowest child mortality rate in human history. This year, it'll probably be even lower. When I was a kid, a majority of human beings had always been illiterate. And now we're pushing 90% adult literacy. Every day another 300,000 people emerge from extreme poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in terms of the hope that I'm trying to leave people with, it's not this sort of blind Panglossian hope that everything is going to work out perfectly, but it's this notion very much tempered by terrible things that are happening and that I reported on, that we can make a difference if we try hard enough, that we have resources and we have tools and understanding about policies that can make a difference, again, imperfectly. And I do think that that is something that we in journalism can do a better job of addressing.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much, Nick. Let's give him a hand. I've known Nick for 20 years, but have not seen you since COVID, so it's really a great privilege to be engaged with you again. And it was a really great privilege to read your book, Chasing Hope, which is just fantastic. And you've written many great books, but there's something so personal about this one that really, really stayed with me. I really kind of drew at least three things from your book. One is that you managed to avoid, as journalists, we're often told we need to be skeptical, but we shouldn't be cynical. And it's easy to say, but actually hard to do in practice. These are very troubled times. And I think sometimes it's hard to get out of the funk of either despair or nihilism that I think our society is increasingly susceptible to. So, just your orientation toward hope gives me hope. Secondly, you really talk about the journalism's possibilities, but also its failings. And you talk about both the honorable aspirations of our profession, but also some of the bad habits we have that have caused us to lose trust. And we're going to talk about that, I hope. And then finally, I think yours is a quintessential American story, but it's a very introspectively told one. You are the son of a European refugee who ended up in Oregon. And, his life was saved by a courageous French diplomat. And, you have had so much success in your life, but you've used that privilege to then help others. And I think that really stayed with me as well. So let's start with some questions. There's a big debate in our field over objectivity. And you don't tackle it quite on the nose in the book, but, we all, read the controversies around in the past few years around whether we can ever be truly objective and dispassionate. Should we even be trying to maintain some kind of neutrality? And of course, news and opinion are differentiated in part by the ability to to at least advance a perspective or not. But what do you think about these traditional notions of objectivity, neutrality, impartiality? Should we retain those notions? Are they the right way of thinking about the journalistic craft in our moment?
So it's something I've puzzled about a lot. And I guess I'd say that this is heresy coming from an opinion person, but I do really think that fundamentally the most important thing we do in journalism is the reporting on what the news side does. But don't tell any of my opinion colleagues that I said this. And opinion can be a useful extra layer, but I think that there has been a drift over the last 20 years to just having opinion and having people stir a pot but not really add anything into it. And that's partly because opinion is cheap. And especially if you're on television, you get a Democrat and a Republican in a studio to have them yell at each other. That is cheap to do, and it's a lot easier than sending somebody out. I read about during the first Congo election, CNN sent Anderson Cooper out to Congo, and huge effort, involved some risk, and his ratings went down that week. CNN hasn't let Anderson anywhere near Congo since, and I think it is because of this. I mean, it's partly because of that, this drift to opinion, and I think in some ways that's kind of unhelpful. I was torn about this in, I think of it maybe as a tension between truth and fairness, is a way of thinking about it. And that normally our mission is to be fair to all sides and also to tell the truth. And mostly they go together. And you quote people on each side, and that is a way of conveying the truth to people. And it felt in 2016 that that was not the case, that we as reporters, from my perspective, basically knew that Hillary Clinton was spinning and misleading people about as much as politicians typically do, and that Donald Trump was off the charts. And I don't think, you looked at polling and it didn't seem that the public was getting what we knew. And I thought that where there is that tension between fairness and truth, then truth has to be what is paramount, which kind of goes to that point. And I think that there have been times in the past when that was true as well. In the McCarthy hearings under Joe McCarthy, the initial impulse was to quote Joe McCarthy saying people were communists and their communists were taking over the State Department, et cetera. And the public thought, well, maybe that's true. And then it took Edward R. Murrow and a few other people belatedly to say, no, this is not true, and to call them out. And then during the Vietnam War as well, and during the Civil Rights Movement, it did not do to quote George Wallace in one breath and Martin Luther King in the other. And people didn't, again, it took reporters actually, if you will, taking sides and focusing on truth rather than fairness. And I think that Trump has presented us with a similar challenge, and that in that tension, truth should predominate. But having said all that, and within the Times, I think, been an advocate for trying to use our moral voice, and that journalism is in part about being a public good and the impact we can have on society. I've also been sort of uncomfortable by the directions in journalism, especially among young journalists, to see news organizations as basically always be vehicles to create a better society. And we saw that at the Times, very painfully with the James Bennett defenestration, which I thought was a huge mistake. I thought that that particular Tom Cotton op-ed, I was not impressed by that particular op-ed, but I thought that we should be running more op-eds by Tom Cottons of the world, if you will. We should be having more conservative voices, that my liberal opinions would have more influence if they were escorted by more conservative views on the opinion pages, that we should write nastier letters to the editor about columnists from conservatives, et cetera. And so I thought firing James was a terrible mistake, and that I'm nervous about the drive in journalism not to include voices that we regard as profoundly wrong or bigoted or whatever it may be.
So Nick, and you've told a lot of stories that do not fit convenient narratives, and those have sometimes been among the more controversial stories you've told. People only seem to love the press when we advance the point of view or the position that the believer holds, which is very unfortunate as well. But let me ask you, just probes a little bit deeper, and let's stay on the news side for a moment. On the one hand, I agree with you. I define the journalistic craft on the news side as we are here to chronicle, document, observe, bear witness, explain. We're not really here to achieve social, political outcomes. On the other hand, your career has shown kind of a belief in an old-fashioned, but I think really commendable belief in that progress is possible. So, does your own life story make it harder to explain to a young journalist why they should focus on the traditional journalistic craft and not on trying to liberate or emancipate or reform or transform?
So I would argue that where I've been able here and there to have some impact, it's not been because of my opinions or my arguments, it's really been because of the reporting. And covering Darfur was not a good topic for a columnist. My opinions were not interesting. Genocide is bad. It's not a very surprising, counterintuitive opinion. But basically, as a columnist, I had free reign to go and to travel and to report. And when people are faced with stories about people being massacred because of the color of their skin or the tribe they belong to, then that's, people get outraged, and then there's pressure to do something, and that did have some impact. And one of my pet causes has been in the U.S. has been child marriage. When I started writing about this, every state allowed children to be married, and often in very large numbers. I wrote, actually in my first piece, I wrote about a 12-year-old here in Florida who was married to a much older man, a man who had raped her. And now we're, 11 states have now banned child marriage. Washington just became the latest, but again, it wasn't that, allowing 12-year-olds to get married to their rapist is a bad idea. That's not an interesting opinion. It was basically reporting, and so I would encourage that young journalists that reporting, especially issues that are not on the agenda, that can have a moral purpose and can serve the public interest, but don't feel that you need to shout about it and jump up and down. It's the reporting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In the nearly 5 years we worked together, I probably got hundreds and hundreds of requests to explain what makes for a good op-ed, and usually people would be surprised when I would say it's not the prominence of the writer, it's not how contrarian their view is, it's the quality of the evidence. And for scholars, it could be evidence that they got through data sets or analysis, but so often example, anecdote, but then building on a kind of body of empirical evidence is the strongest way to make an argument. And people would actually be genuinely surprised by that because they get their model from TV where it's people have an ideological preconception and are really just there to advance that. So I think that was really, really valuable. You talk about when you arrive in a place, trying to get out of the capital. Whether it's a foreign country, you kind of avoided Washington coverage in your career, partly because some early experiences you did covering Congress didn't leave you feeling that that was the most satisfying. We have a lot of reporters here who are based in Washington, and there's nothing wrong with that. I used to be based in Washington, and I'm based in a state capital now, Austin. How can those of us who cover power keep in mind or better reflect the impact of that power on ordinary people and communities?
So I think if you look back at coverage of the New Deal, for example, which was one of the most transformative periods in American history, then the best reporting of that mixed what FDR was doing and the incredible policies that he was espousing with what that meant on the ground around the country. And I mean, for example, in my little town, the high school was built in 1935 as a works progress administration project to hire 101 people. And that high school has since become the center of the community. It's a very important part of it. And rural electrification, likewise, completely transformative in Yamhill. And so I think there's a challenge. What happens in Washington is so important on the policy side, but I do think it's useful if it's not just a policy argument in depth, but also looks at what actually happens. And I've wondered if, because of who we as journalists are, we haven't adequately focused on some of the issues that matter most for a lot of people. And if you think about the insulin price cap, this is something that matters pretty acutely to 8 million Americans. But insulin prices aren't such a big issue for us and for the people we talk to, our community. And I think we have undercovered that issue and the significance of it. And so, I think there are ways. I think the policy, Washington policy side is so utterly important, but I do think it's useful to mix that with how it actually plays out across the country.
So I want to stay on politics for a moment. I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit, but I think the temptation that we have sometimes we have a temptation to have a monocausal or just a few fundamental explanations of Trump and Trumpism. And obviously racism, misogyny, et cetera, are a huge part of that. Trump obviously has also been able to tap into a well of resentment that people have in communities like the one you grew up in. Folks who feel, and you grew up in a largely white community, but a working class community and a community where a lot of people have felt left behind. Even Oregon, although it's generally liberal, I don't need to tell you that in Eastern Oregon you might as well be part of Idaho, as some would like. How are we continuing to miss the boat, or have we gotten better 8 years later at kind of covering where Trumpism comes from? And I mentioned the ism because I think long after Trump is either finishing his second term as president, or maybe third, or gone from the scene politically in other ways, we'll be dealing with the populist authoritarian temptation that you talk about a little bit in the book. And so have we gotten better at capturing that reality? The kind of nuanced reality of why people support?
I think that while newsrooms have become so much more diverse in so many ways, one area in which we're not particularly diverse is class, and that is a real weakness. I mean, diversity has made us much, much better at covering America and the world, but class and faith, actually. I mean, if you think about, how many evangelicals are there in major news organizations, especially white evangelicals, not very many. And I think that has led, plus the way in which opinion has infiltrated a lot of coverage, to this tendency to dismiss all Trump voters as racists and bigots. So in my 10-minute political career, I'm running in the Democratic primary, and it was, trying to get donors, and I found it very frustrating, the degree to which there was a tendency to see every Trump voter in that category, and also the degree to which people wanted me to thunder about, how awful Republicans were. And, meanwhile, if you're in Portland, Portland is a mess, and you just can't blame Portland's messiness on Republicans because there aren't any Republicans in Portland. This is a mess we created. This is our mess. And I think I'm sensitive to the argument that all Trump voters are bigots and racists because about 2/3 of the people in Yamhill do vote for Trump. I think of my friend Mary Mayer, who was a very, very strong Trump supporter, And 4 members of her family killed themselves. Mary once she was homeless 7 years. She had long addiction. She was beaten up by her former husband. She once put a gun to her head. And she felt that nobody was listening to people like her. And then finally Trump comes along and he says, we're gonna build the factories again. And your problem is those immigrants, and we're gonna ship them out. And this was something that she longed to hear somebody talking to her and saying how he's gonna fix her problems. And she also, I think, felt that Democrats she recovered from addiction because of church's help, and she felt that Democrats were condescending to her about faith, and so, I think that it is indeed it becomes too simplistic to just dismiss that Trump world as all racists and bigots. And I think it's possible for the media, and for that matter, for Democrats, to be very tough on Trump personally and on elected officials, but to be a little more forgiving about ordinary voters.
My final question before we open it up to everyone. One thing that you don't touch on in the book is your own kind of personal set of beliefs around faith and religion. So you grew up, your father had been raised Catholic and your mother had been raised Protestant. Would you be willing to talk with us a little bit about your own kind of belief system and how that's affected your journalism?
So I was, because my dad was Catholic and my mom Presbyterian, so I was dragged to church twice each Sunday. So I kind of felt by 18 I'd had a life's exposure to church. And so I don't think my personal religious views have greatly affected my work. I guess I'd put myself in kind of the agnostic camp or kind of a Spinoza camp of, but I very strongly believe that faith is a really important part of life abroad and at home, and that we in journalism don't adequately cover it. And you look in opinion pages, and we barely cover a topic that is a huge driver of political outcomes, of social outcomes, of happiness, of all kinds of kind of local mobilization to address some of the problems that we talked about. And it always strikes me as a little curious that when I'm covering Afghanistan or Pakistan or Yemen, then Americans do have some intellectual curiosity about Islam, including about kind of militant Islam. And yet there's much less interest, it seems to me, in kind of militant evangelicalism, if you will, in this country. And I was talking at breakfast about Pentecostals, and that's just this huge movement around so much of the world. And paradoxically, empowerment of women, I think, is one of the transformative forces that have affected so much of the world. And Pentecostals have done much, much more to empower women in Africa, for example, than all the NGOs in the world. And that's because, you have women who are able to step up and speak for God. And I don't share any Pentecostal theology, and disagree with a lot of their conservative takes about almost anything. But you can't look at some of these forces and not see the power of them. And I don't think that we adequately cover that in journalism.
Thank you, Nick. What a privilege.
Thank you, Phil. It's been great.
It's great. Okay, thanks you guys. All right, now you don't have to clap after everybody all the time, all day long, but today's been a little special. So let's start off with Will Salatan and then Adele Banks. We got lots of questions. So Will, you're up.
Nick, that was great. I've never heard you speak before, and now I wish I had, because I would have read every one of your columns in your voice. It's terrific. Two things. One is, I hope, since you mentioned that our biggest impact is by what we elevate. So you got a room full of journalists. Before you leave, you got to give us 10 things we need to cover that we're not covering enough of. But I wanted to hear more about your thoughts about the Tom Cotton situation, because you said it was somehow unhealthy or bad that they had silenced it, even though you thought the op-ed itself was not good. Why? I mean, just speaking to a liberal journalist, what is it that we get out of hearing those voices? Is it per se that there should be some kind of balance, or is there something about humility or error or some larger theory that you have about why we need to hear those voices?
Should I answer one by one as we go? And the first thing I'm not sure about 10 things to cover, but just the kind of working class dysfunction in America, I think we've got to do a better job covering. And whether it's addiction, which I worry is getting worse as prices fall. You know, it used to be it cost $20 to get high. Then it was $5 to get high. And now, as you get more and more synthetic drugs, fentanyl was just the first of them. Now you've got netazine coming along, and already the meth that is coming along is now synthetic, and the prices, the cost to produce a hit of some of these new drugs coming along is in the cents, and I really worry about where that takes us. And so I think that the value of having some of these voices that I disagree with is kind of twofold. At the individual level, I do think that, that we can be wrong on a lot of things, or that we miss important arguments. So I think it's probably easier for my generation to feel some intellectual humility, because the left was profoundly wrong on one of the great issues of the 20th century, which was that the left tended to be soft on communism and Maoism, and that was a huge, huge blunder. And you look at New York Times coverage of the Maoist period, and it's kind of embarrassing. We did a report from Red China in 1972, a book, and you wince at it. Even on, I think that family structure has been an issue that it became impossible after the Moynihan Report for liberals to talk about. I mean, Bell knows this much better than I and has written about it, but that was something that conservatives talked about and liberals didn't, because we thought then we're blaming the victim. And it wasn't until William Julius Wilson wrote about it and kind of gave us permission that we began to talk about it, and we should have been listening. That again is a huge issue that impacts places like Yamhill. And I've written a lot about gun policy. I avoid, because I'm a liberal and believe in more gun safety measures, I avoid the evidence that doesn't really fit into my narrative. And it's good to have conservatives write about guns. Early on, the New York Times did a piece when the first open carry laws were passed, predicting that people were going to be shooting each other right and left in streets across America. And in fact, it turned out that basically open carry and even concealed carry has less of an impact on that, because if you could actually pass the licenses, then you were probably more likely to be in your 40s and probably didn't have a criminal record. And it's the access that younger people have with criminal records that has made us more violent. So I think there, even in areas like that, I think there are things we can learn from. And the other is, the other whole dimension of, I think, the benefit having more conservative voices is that we would have more credibility as a news organization if we had more conservative voices in the paper if we let letters to the editor savage me the way I savage conservatives, and we don't. If you look at the tone of letters to the editor in the New York Times, people can't be as nasty to me as I am about other people. And I think that we would be better off if we had really tough, more conservative opinion pieces and letters to the editor.
That's great. Adele Banks from Religion News Service.
Thanks so much for your comments. You talked so much about great, great tragedies and covering them. But I was also struck about your saying that we cover planes that crash rather than planes that take off. So I'm wondering if you can give us a few examples of when you've done something in that way.
So, when you ask people in opinion polls about global poverty, is it getting worse, getting better, or staying the same? About 90% of Americans say that it is either getting worse or staying the same.
It's gotten much better.
In fact, one of the great transformations over the last 50 years has been this historic reduction in global poverty. When I graduated from college, 41% of the world's people were living in extreme poverty. And even adjusting for inflation, now we're below 10%. The number of people dying each year has collapsed. And if you look at attitudes, gender attitudes, LGBTQ attitudes, again, just incredible revolutions that are, I think, examples of this, the way trends are often good, even as incidents that we cover are often bad. Aviation safety may be actually a metaphor that fits in with planes that crash. The aviation safety has greatly improved, and the risk of life lost every 100 million miles has gone way down. But there still are, planes that in midair lose their former doors and so on.
Or in the Congo, a right wheel when you're going down, and it might all go bad. You got to read the book.
The book begins with a plane crash in Congo. So I think, we obviously have to cover planes that crash. I worry about this in my coverage of Africa, because if you look at what I cover in Africa, it's South Sudan, it's Congo, it's the AIDS crisis, it's all this negative stuff, which is true. And that needs more coverage, not less. And yet, unless one also acknowledges that Africa has been making tremendous progress, fertility has been coming way down, there's been incredible progress on HIV/AIDS, then I think readers get the misimpression that everything is falling apart in ways that make it harder to get investment and tourism, et cetera. And so, how one squares that, I don't fully know, but I don't know that we quite get that right.
Daniel Littman from Politico.
Thank you so much. In your coverage, when you would interview like the perpetrators of genocide or just bad stuff around the world, did they sometimes, if it happened years before, how often would they feel like guilty of having done that stuff? And would you kind of frame it as like almost like good and evil in terms of like Janjaweed and Cambodia, or was it a lot of it was like driven by economic deprivation where they felt like this was the only choice that they had to imprison young girls and the like? Thank you.
I think it's both. I really, especially in Darfur, that word evil, evil feels like the sort of Old Testament word, and you go in Darfur and it's evil. I met a guy who'd been held down and his eyes gouged out with a bayonet, and it's just, that's evil. But there were also, it didn't just happen out of nothing. It did happen out of a context in which climate change there'd been desertification problems, and there was competition between nomads and settled farmers, and there were genuine grievances. There had been a rebellion by these three ethnicities that led to this, scorched earth counterinsurgency. And I think that's kind of what typically happens, that people have excuses for the terrible things that they do, and that it's useful as journalists to understand how people manage to commit what really does seem to me to be evil, but it's not for the most part because they're psychopaths or sociopaths. It's I think it is driven by these other broader forces. It's not a very great answer, but I do.
What about the first part in terms of like whether they ever felt like, oh yeah, I should not have done that? Like how second thoughts on that?
They tended to get defensive, and so they tended not to say, I shouldn't have killed those guys, but they did often voice regret at the loss of life generally, that it's too bad the way things have worked out. They should have left quietly rather than resisting, this kind of thing. And I think that there was, in Myanmar with the Rohingya, again, people had been living side by side, and then the Rakhine people just started torching villages and throwing babies in a bonfire, just committing terrible, terrible acts. And one of the problems was that it was often young men who were kind of leading the charge and doing things that other people in the community had misgivings about, but not sufficient misgivings so they would stand up to the perpetrators. And so I think in both Darfur and in Myanmar and in some other contexts, it was often a minority of really nasty people who committed the great majority of the atrocities, and the bulk of people kind of didn't take sides and sided with their ethnicity, but with reservations. And there was, one of the things that struck me in Liberia and Sierra Leone and some other places was the involvement of women in some of the sexual violence, the gang rapes. And I was trying to understand why women would be involved in going out and getting victims and bringing them back or holding them down. And as far as I could tell, it was because there was a recognition that these are things beyond the pale, that mass raping people because of their ethnicity is wrong, and that the gangs or the militias or the perpetrators, they needed to get people to commit some terrible action so that they would be part of the team, if you will. And so the purpose of getting women to go recruit, to bring victims back, or to participate in horrible actions was that sort of pushed them over a line. And so then they were collectively outsiders beyond the pale, and that created a unifying force among those committing these actions. And I think that does reflect some notion among the perpetrators that what they were doing was wrong and a breach of all human principles.
Let's flip to Ashley Parker, another Pulitzer winner at the Post.
Hi. So as a member of the media, the quickest way for me to hate the media is to get a call from a reporter writing about the Post, right? Or when I worked for Maureen, getting a call of someone writing about Maureen. So in your 10 minutes as a political candidate, you were talking about answering the question, kind of learning of dealing with reporters. But I'm curious, what frustrated you the most about political coverage of yourself and the reporters you were dealing with, and what criticisms or advice would you have to journalists doing that?
So, I mean, one of the problems is just not enough coverage. I mean, like Oregon, the news organizations are just collapsing. You know, the Oregonian is a shadow of what it was. Outside of Portland, these organizations are just disappearing, you know, by the day. So that is really the most striking thing. In terms of coverage itself, I thought that partly because of competition for audience, that there was a lot of coverage of individuals and personalities and almost none of policies. So, you know, homelessness is this huge problem up and down the West Coast. And I don't think we have made very serious efforts to, you know, convey to the public that, you know, the degree to which this is in large part about housing supply, for example. I don't think people really get that. And so I'd love to see kind of more sophisticated policy. I mean, of course, nobody would ever read these pieces, and that's the challenge. You know, how do you write about some of these topics and actually get people to read it? But I do think that we can probably try to do a better job with, you know, things like solutions journalism and the policy journalism side to match the political side of it.
Can I ask if Sewell wants to weigh in on that a little bit? I mean, you guys have enough holding politicians accountable at work in Texas. Your paper's a little bit unique. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this query about covering candidates?
Yeah, I do think that there's a natural emphasis to focus on personalities, but you have to kind of pull back and also look at bigger changes. I actually think journalism's gotten better in this respect. There's a lot more analysis now of the electorate. There's a lot more analysis of, you know, campaign finance, a lot more data journalism. So I don't think that should take the place of traditional campaign coverage, but I think it's a needed balance. You know, one thing that I'm very worried about, especially in Texas, is, you know, that the norms are eroding and that the, you know, idea that you should even give the press access or hold press conferences or give interviews is kind of rapidly going away, and people want to talk to publications that they think will be favorable or sympathetic to them, and that's one of my big worries.
This sort of goes to that, and to your point, Ashley, that one of the things that surprised me about my team was that they didn't really think that news coverage was going to be that relevant or helpful to us, and their view was a good article will help a little bit at the margin, but that there's always the risk that I'll say something really stupid and that will be very damaging. And so they thought interviews, yeah, okay, that's fine, but they were not appreciative of free media opportunities to the degree that I had expected, whereas they thought that raising money by advertising was simply the way to go. And yeah, I found that kind of disappointing as a journalist.
Let's do maybe one more question and then take a break, and then we'll get back and go strong. Maybe can we do Matt Lewis?
Sure. So one of the things I've noticed, everyone has noticed this about Donald Trump, is this blame America first attitude. You know, the world is on fire. You know, we're fools. We're being taken advantage of. Things are worse than they've ever been. And I'm wondering how much of the media's propensity or tendency to talk about plane crashes maybe inadvertently reinforces Trump's message that America's horrible. You might as well do something radical because it's Flight 93, basically.
I think that is probably true. I mean, it has struck me that you know, we focus on Trump in this country, but he has analogs all around the Western world. And you look at, you know, Le Pen in France, or you know, Germany, Sweden, Britain. They all have these kind of extremists who came out of nowhere. How this sort of reliably liberal, eminently normal country like the Netherlands could have, Geert Wilders be now the leading politician kind of astonishes me. And I do think that they all, Trump is a particularly kind of dramatic element to that, but there are a lot of analogs in other countries. I don't think it's just Trump, and and certainly in other countries, people do blame the rise of social media and negativity as part of what is driving those contingents, those kind of extreme right folks. And that kind of makes sense to me, that we've helped enable the rise of cynicism and skepticism in ways that allow people like Trump in this country or others in other countries to take advantage of them. So I think that's right. What do you think? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know, looking back and hindsight and all of that, what we might have done differently, but I do think that if the goal were to create a culture that could defeat MAGA Trumpism, one way to do that would be to educate Americans about how good things actually are. I mean, I think people who are hopeless or who believe that things are worse than they've ever been are much more vulnerable to that siren call. And I actually think they're just factually wrong, just historically speaking, but very few people are preaching the message that things are good, that things are positive.
Can I know, Josh, you said one more.
Please hit that mic.
Sorry.
Share it with our friends.
This is directly related to what I wanted to ask you, Nick. I almost feel, though, that there's a thread of condescension through that, which is to say, I actually think one reason distrust in the media is so high right now and why there might be a lack of solutions journalism is that there seems to be wide-scale disagreement on that there's actually problems for people. And I don't know if that has to do with an impulse to want to say that things in Biden's America are better than they actually are because of the stakes of the election. But when we talk about crime in big cities, for example, since the pandemic, I almost feel that the impulse of the media is to say the discomfort you feel in your neighborhood about rampant carjacking is somehow invalid because this specific category of violent crime has gone down since 1975 or whatever. So I don't know, is that something worth considering too, that maybe there's not a willingness to actually reckon with what people are seeing day to day in their lives?
So I take your point that it's probably hard to convince people that crime is going down if they've just had their catalytic converter stolen. I think that was partly Portland's experience. I do think, though, that Matt has a point that, in general, because of our coverage, our focus on things that go wrong, I do think that just as internationally people don't appreciate, they 80% or 90% think that global poverty is getting worse or staying the same. In fact, it's much better. That people don't appreciate the various metrics of progress in this country, and you see that in polling on economic growth by party. That Democrats always think the economy is worse than it actually is when a Republican is president, and vice versa. And so part of the problem, I suppose, is a lack of any kind of shared facts. But I do think that that we all suffer from a selection bias in our news sources, and that the upshot is that we tend to often believe that things are worse than they actually are by various metrics, and that we could probably do a better job in addressing that without but completely taking your point about not glossing over enormous ongoing problems, whether it's crime or like what people in Yamhill would say is the losses of addiction, the loss of family structure, the loss of good jobs, and it'd be very hard, I think, to tell my neighbors that things are getting better when they're really struggling. And we started a wine and cider business in 2018, and one of our goals was to hire more of the local employees I grew up with, who tend to be very hostile to immigrants. And it was kind of fascinating that we hired, so we had the vineyard area, which was managed by a vineyard management company that hired almost all Latino workers. And the Latino workers would show up at 6 a.m., work incredibly industriously. These local members of the white working class would sort of show up at 9, immediately borrow $5 worth of gas, work for a few hours, then go on a break. And they were watching the Latino immigrants on the other side, and they saw that there was no way they could compete with them in the quality of their work. And I think that fed their resentment at immigrants, and, if you will, sometimes the xenophobia that went with it. But it's very hard for somebody who's in their 40s and had been addicted to drugs for decades, and then to actually compete and hold a job and be productive at this point. And they would, I think, I think they would profoundly disagree with a lot of what I have to say, and would say things are worse than they've ever been. And what are you talking about? I can't get a good job. But that's partly because nobody in their right mind would ever hire them.
All right, we'll come back and we'll start with Miranda Kennedy from Vox after a break. It's 10:35. Let's maybe resume at 10:50 if that works. And then, if you don't have plans at lunch, sit with Nick and Sewell, and you'll get, like the guys down the road, they get stock tips at the golf course. You can get leads on your next story from these guys from Will's question. All right, 10:50. All right, just quick good of the order before we start taping again. Wanted to name that Christina Lamb, who is just a wonderful journalist and was planning to be with us. She's fine, she's doing well. Her mother has cancer that's gotten quite a bit worse in the last 10 days or so. So only last Wednesday or so, she shifted out, and Sewell Chan stepped in, which is a wonderful gift to all of us. All right, can we keep it going? And we'll turn that camera on again, and maybe let's start with Miranda Kennedy from Vox.
Thanks, it's so nice to have you here. Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Yeah. So I'm interested in what you said about choosing to find stories on the margins where you could have more change, more impact. Can you give some examples of the types of topics where you feel you've been able to do that, and then what exactly the impact was, what you saw change?
Yeah. So I think the child marriage one was a good example, because it was something that just, once people began to think about, should young teenagers really be able to get married, then instinctively the answer tends to be no, and then state legislatures have been responding by making it illegal. But it's not a particularly sexy topic that tends to generate coverage. Beginning in the early 2000s, I wrote about maternal mortality and morbidity, which was a very odd topic for a New York Times op-ed column, and in particular about a condition called obstetric fistula. which is, again, not an obvious topic for a column. But once people realize that there are a lot of, 15-year-old girls out there in Ethiopia or Sierra Leone or wherever it may be, fistulas, and get this repaired for $450 and get their life back, then immediately there began to be a competition among left and right. And partly this sort of fed into the reproductive health wars, and each side wanted to show how compassionate they were. And so the result has been hundreds of millions of dollars going, and fistula there's been tremendous improvement in access to fistula repairs. Maternal mortality has dropped in half since the early 2000s. Now about 250,000 women a year die of it, which is still way too many, but it was more than 500,000. And I've come to think, for example, so now I've been pushing the issue of cervical cancer instead. If we're going to talk about reproductive health, and now more women worldwide die of cervical cancer than of maternal mortality. And cervical cancer is something that, no woman in the 21st century should die of cervical cancer. This is something that is basically completely preventable. Even in the US, a woman dies every 2 hours from cervical cancer, and much, much more common than maternal deaths in the US. And Australia and Rwanda have kind of led the world in addressing that. And my argument is, if we care about reproductive health, as we should, then it's not just about abortion, but also about make sure women don't die needlessly of cervical cancer. But it is hard to write about these issues that nobody is talking about, that nobody particularly cares about, that are off the agenda, and that they just don't really feel like topics, especially for op-ed columns. Trafficking was another example. I think there's been real progress in trafficking, both globally and domestically. Globally, and domestically, people have, pimps have kind of worked out that you're much better off having a 20-year-old woman who is quasi-voluntarily with you rather than kidnapping a 15-year-old from a village somewhere, because there is a risk of bad consequences if you are enslaving an underage girl. And so, you're a lot less likely to see underage girls locked up in brothels around the world than you were.
Can you speak, Nick? I want to go to Christina about the Atlantic next, but can you speak to observation of the faith angle in some of that? Like, we had Gary Haugen speak at this table, and others who have worked on anti-trafficking initiatives. Is there some kind of religious current that is, in your view, alive, active, relevant, constructive in covering such issues, particularly around trafficking?
Oh, absolutely. And there was, a lot of folks here will have a better sense of this, including you, Josh. But so my perception is that really somewhere around the late 90s and beginning of the 2000s, on the evangelical right, there became much more of a global interest in engaging on some of these global issues. And so it was everybody from Franklin Graham in South Sudan and the Nuba Mountains of Sudan, to a lot of folks working on trafficking issues, on AIDS issues, and the best example is George W. Bush and PEPFAR, the AIDS initiative. That I think was the single best initiative of any president in the last, 75 years. And it was completely transformative. And I don't think I certainly was not sufficiently appreciative of it at the time. And I wrote a lot of carping columns about the fact that too much money was put in the abstinence part of it. And that was all true. But if you look at how many tens of millions of lives have been saved, it was just an incredible initiative. And on maternal health, on trafficking, there was this sort of remarkable coalition between conservative evangelicals and liberal feminists that addressed issues like trafficking and made a real difference in, in places like Cambodia and with fistula repairs. And each side somewhat distrusted the other, but they made real progress. I think that has not, I think that it has frayed somewhat since then. And I think partly that was that in the Trump era that each side became more suspicious of the other, partly for good reason. But when they worked together, they accomplished just incredible things.
Christine.
Is this on? Great. Thank you so much for coming. This has been fascinating. I'm still just really interested in pushing on this idea of hope, of planes, focusing on planes that are flying instead of crashing. And I wonder if you ever worry about hope being misused in a sense. I'm thinking of, okay, we're looking at the numbers on global poverty. It's down. Global poverty is down. So let's not talk about global inequality or the fact that even if you're not in extreme under $1 a day poverty, like $2 a day isn't amazing either necessarily. Or even, falling childhood poverty in the United States, it's falling. So why would we do a Medicaid expansion then? And I feel like this is just saying that aloud feels very cynical and skeptical on my behalf. But I guess my second question is, do you think that level of cynicism, skepticism, you mentioned nihilism, has increased significantly in the past 5 years, 10 years? If so, why? And what do you think can be done?
So on the first question about whether talking about progress can lead to complacency, I see that, I can see that as a theoretical issue, but in practice, I think the opposite. During Darfur, I became very frustrated by the lack of traction my columns were getting. And in particular, you may remember around that time that in New York City, there were these 2 red-tailed hawks that were pushed out of their nest. Do you remember that? And all of New York City was up in arms about these 2 homeless red-tailed hawks. And I thought, I can't generate the same outrage about hundreds of thousands of people being, killed and so on. And so that led me to the work in social psychology about what makes us care. And part of it is about telling individual stories. It's about an emotional connection before there's a rational connection. But the other is also feeling that there can be some efficacy, that there can be some difference in outcomes. And so people are willing to get engaged and learn about an issue and help if they think there can be a better outcome, but that there's often a sense of resignation. And so I think in both global and domestic poverty, the problem, one reason that we haven't done more to tackle it, is a sense of hopelessness and a sense that nothing works. And I think that that is in fact wrong. I think we do have policies that make a difference, that don't exactly solve problems, but dramatically reduce the scale of suffering. And so I think that talking about this backdrop of progress actually is more likely to stimulate further efforts, further investments to try to address it, rather than breed the kind of complacency that, that it can be a risk as well. And it obviously, to some degree, it depends on the framing, and one has to acknowledge that, okay, we've made this progress against poverty, and if we now add vitamin A supplementation or add, female literacy training or whatever it may be, we can do that much better. But I do think that actually talking about progress is a way to further lead to investments in addressing ongoing gaps. And as to what leads to that kind of nihilism, I don't fully know, but I do wonder if bleak coverage may contribute to it. I would say that in my neighbors in Yamhill, some of them have reasons to feel pretty bleak and to feel that they're kind of in a quagmire, and at this point, their kids have sometimes grown up pretty much feral, and it's hard to see how their kids will ever do better, or their grandkids. They're in a kind of a cycle that it is a little hard to see what the escape route is when there's that much dysfunction. And so, I have two neighbors I can immediately think of in the area who are both talking about armed revolution. And this is probably just like grand talk. I mean, I don't really know how to process that, but it makes me worry.
Meredith McGraw with Politico.
Hi. One thing I think we've seen increase in the Trump era, and maybe it's a chicken or the egg thing, is people just seeking out information in places where their own biases are confirmed, and you talked about that. Is there any remedy you see for that in getting to people who or getting people to see past just going to the news outlet that reflects what they think? And then what do you think we're still getting wrong about covering Trump?
On the first one, I think a lot of it is just human nature, and the first study I know of involving that goes back to the early 60s, and social scientists send out a mailing to large numbers of registered Democrats and registered Republicans asking what further information you want about politics. And even back then, basically Democrats wanted first information that would make the other side look dumb, second, information that would make their own side look smart, and third, the last thing they wanted was any smart view that would undermine their own views. And then that all became much more feasible, of course, with digital media, and where we all have what Nicholas Negroponte called the daily me that perfectly reflects our prejudices and biases. In terms of how we address it, I think we can. I think there's some evidence that media literacy training can, among young people, can be helpful. I don't know about the quality of evidence, and I haven't paid a lot of attention, but it seems, I think there's some indications that it can be helpful. And that's also, I think, another reason why I would like to see news organizations have more conservative views and nastier letters to the editor, because I think then it would give, it would make mainstream organizations feel less like they're liberal and be more likely to get conservatives to read them and maybe trust a little bit more what, some left-winger like Christoph says. My own path in that is, well, every morning I go for a run, and it's painful, and but I feel it makes a better me. In the same way I read the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. It's painful, but it builds a better me.
That's great. Sewell, do you want to weigh in on that one as well? You guys are covering Trump.
Yeah. Well, we're taking an approach to elections coverage this year that is more bottom up, and trying to look at how democracy is lived and experienced in ordinary Texas communities, and not focusing too much on the presidential. I think we've also found that, there are so many divides in America right now. Obviously, race and gender are among them, but so is the education divide, which you talk about in your book, that if you've gone to a four-year college of any kind, you're more likely to vote D, and if you didn't, you're much more likely to vote R. And I think that has a lot of troubling implications for our society, because we should want all sorts of people to go to university if they can and if it's appropriate, so that we have a more productive society. And that's become a major divide, the urban-rural divide, and of course the people of faith versus secular. And we find in Texas often that the urban-rural divide is the most important divide a lot of people think about. So some of the places in Texas where we've received the most positive reception have been rural areas like Lubbock, Amarillo. Adam used to study in Lubbock, and it's because there aren't, frankly, really a lot of Democrats to argue with. So these are not places where there's a lot of culture wars, and it's much more like, oh, if a news organization can help cover broadband or community colleges or brain drain, agriculture, they're very interested in seeing those issues surfaced in Austin. So we have found that to be a very kind of pragmatic approach, and it kind of diffuses a little bit of the heat over politics. I mean, I'll just venture one more thing that's a little bit controversial, but I'm coming to think that a lot of words that we use or labels that we use have kind of lost meaning. I think when there are liberals who try to shut down speech on campuses, it's not very liberal. When there are conservatives who want, like a Jacobin-style revolution in America, it doesn't seem very conservative. And just to throw out one more provocation, if I haven't already done too much, it's, sometimes people identify as evangelical because they support Trump now, even if they haven't set foot in a church in quite a while. And so I think that's something also we have to be careful about. And to me, it's always about precision, right? If someone's like a faithful, churchgoer, and it's relevant to the story you're telling, just say that, I think. But sometimes we reduce to shorthands, and people reduce themselves to shorthands that are actually not that informative about the actual nature of their beliefs.
Zachary Davis with Faith Matters.
Thank you, Nick. I grew up reading your columns, one could say religiously, and you really helped develop my own moral conscience. And I even designed my own private study abroad to study human trafficking in New Delhi as a BYU student. Learned so much from you, so it's an honor to be here with you. I want to build a little bit on what Sewell just alluded to, which is I was quite touched tragically in that family that lost 5 children. It's horrific. And the deaths of despair phrase tries to capture some of this terrible tragedy of premature deaths, often self-inflicted. And you mentioned as a cause for Yamhill's problems, deindustrialization, suggesting that it's mainly like an economic crisis that then leads to all these self-destructive behaviors. But I'm curious too if there are spiritual causes as well, that there is, that we have a major spiritual crisis and a crisis of meaning that is contributing to the problems that a lot of these communities are having. And I think everybody recognizes that journalists in elite places, there's a class divide between the people that they're trying to cover. But I think, I would guess, I don't know for sure, but so many elite journalists just themselves aren't particularly religious, maybe didn't even grow up religious, and have a difficulty even inhabiting that world of meaning making in this way. And that purpose and meaning for a lot of these journalists is like career-based. So I'm curious if there's a way, and if you've thought about, could journalists help with this meaning crisis by infusing in their work more explicit conversation about how American society can develop, more meaning language, more meaning talk?
So I've thought a lot about this question about why my neighbors struggled so much, and I do think that it was fundamentally driven in part by a loss of good jobs, and I think that partly because of William Julius Wilson and his work originally with a urban African-American community, and I think that what he wrote about that community was very much applicable to rural white communities a generation later. But the problem with that analysis is then, why wasn't the Great Depression a problem in places like Yamhill? People lost their jobs, and you didn't have these same kind of self-destructive behaviors. And I think that goes to the question, the point you're making about sense of purpose and about spiritual connections. I think that a characteristic of a previous kind of job was that they were more likely to convey an identity as well. And that when somebody was a carpenter or a farmer or whatever, or a member of the local union, then that was a part of their identity. Whereas I think now being on a factory floor and just, putting widgets together or something, and having your schedule, assigned by a manager 10 days in advance or whatever, I don't think people get the same sense of identity or purpose or meaning from that. And I also think maybe even more fundamentally that in the 1930s, in places like Yamhill, there were all kinds of social connections that buffered the losses of good jobs. And some of that was church communities, but it was also men's groups, women's groups, extended families, and those, now we're all bowling alone. I mean, now those organizations largely disappeared, and alcohol was the social lubricant in that period. And alcohol can diminish social capital, but it can also create social capital. It's kind of complicated. When it came to meth just destroyed social capital. It just destroyed trust in these communities. I think that and it does strike me that in Yamhill, the one community that was immune to all this was the local Mormon community. If you were in the local Mormon community, there was essentially zero chance you were going to end up using drugs. And I think that, and that was not true of the local Catholic church, the local Methodist church, the local Christian church was sort of pan-denominational. And I think that, I think it was less a sense of what people were getting actually in the spiritual side, but more the sense of community and linkages that provided this buffer from the trauma of outside forces. And in the absence of that, loneliness, especially for men, just became a huge problem. And men lost their jobs, and they basically just sat in front of the TV all day drinking beer and eating potato chips. That, in a way that I think was not true in previous generations.
Somebody should write an article about that, Christine. Josh Kwan with The Gathering.
Let me apologize in advance for the long windup. I have to take this opportunity to just share a quick story with you, Nick. About 30 years ago, sorry, this dates both of us, in a big pile of hate mail, you may have received one fan letter. And this fan letter wrote, in the most cringy freshman year way of writing a letter, oh, dear Nick Kristof, what an amazing journalist you are. And congrats on China Wakes, and congrats on your Pulitzers. How do you become a foreign correspondent? And you took the time to write back to this individual, go for it. Just go find a place that you want to be and write to the people who write from that place and see if you can stick around and be a volunteer, be an intern, do whatever it takes. And so I did that and had the time of my life. It was 1997. Hong Kong was in the midst of a handover, and that captured my imagination for journalism. So thank you for that. I'll also say that you may be among the most popular liberal columnists among conservative Christians. And it's for these reasons that you are willing to look at the contributions that some of these Christians make. And you're willing to write about the warts and all, but you do shine a light on some of the contributions they've made, especially in the international realm. You've also written these, I think, sometimes annual dialogues that you have with Christians. And you express part of your faith in your own inner monologue and relationship with faith and with Christianity. And I think it opens your readers to a deeper understanding of who you are and how you see the world. My question is how you sort of take this tension of you want to have objectivity and partiality and less of this kind of personality-driven journalism that may have its own challenges? And how do you hold that in tension with maybe actually revealing more of yourself and as a tool for engaging with readers and helping readers understand where you come from, and maybe even adding credibility and trust through sharing part of your story? How do you think about that?
You know, it's a great question, and it's a tension that I haven't fully worked out myself. And, you know, there is no doubt that when you tell personal stories, that resonates with readers and they like it, and it creates it creates an opening into a topic, and yet it also you know, then it becomes about you and not about the issue, and how do you balance that? I haven't fully figured that out. I was really influenced because I'm always trying to figure out how would it get more attention for issues that I care about. Like in all the pieces I've written about trafficking, it was that incident where I bought these two young women and got, you know, written receipts for buying them that generated the most interest in this issue of, you know, teenagers literally being enslaved in brothels until they die of AIDS. And that, you know, that had both felt like a really kind of right at the edge intrusion into the story, putting myself in there. And yet it was also very successful at actually getting attention to an issue that I cared deeply about. And so I struggle with that. I was in about 2004 or so, there was a reporter based in Baghdad who I'm sure a number of us know, and you may remember the story. She sent a letter to friends just describing, you know, she's very busy, and so she sent just a joint letter to a bunch of friends about what life is like for a reporter in Baghdad. And it immediately went viral all over the world. And it made me think, how is it that, you know, reporters have trouble getting on the front page and have trouble getting read, but when they just write a letter to friends, then it ends up getting shared and everybody reads it and finds it fascinating. And it is precisely because of this question of you inject yourself and talk about just the fact that every time you go into Baghdad from the airport, it costs $10,000 for security for that little, you know, that little drive. Just those personal stories, I think, made the issue of Iraq and what it's going through more accessible. And that made me think that, you know, whether we're columnists or foreign correspondents, that on balance, we should be willing to inject ourselves more in the story if there's an easy way of doing it, if it's going to draw attention to, you know, important issues that need more attention. But I totally haven't figured that out. I still struggle with that question of balance.
Let's go. I've got Daniel Lippman, Matt Lewis. I'm embarrassed. I don't have my list. Maggie Phillips. Maggie, you're up from the tablet.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk, you kind of addressed it, but the decline of civic engagement, you know, why does someone talk about violent overthrow of the government? Why do Dutch people vote for Geert Wilders? Why do people become hopeless? It's because they feel like they can't do anything. And with the decline of civic institutions, there are fewer outlets for unpaid work that make you feel like you're making a difference in your community through civic engagement. And we know there's been a decline in institutional trust and civic engagement. And I was wondering whether, in your opinion, the media has any culpability for that, whether in reporting on institutions that's done something to erode public trust and therefore a decline in these institutions that previously would have allowed other outlets for action and participation in community, a thickness to your social life.
I mean, I'm a little bit conflicted, you know, about that. I mean, I went into journalism, you know, partly in the aftermath of Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein, and that was a great example of taking down an institution, the presidency, and yet it was incredibly important journalism that I found inspiring, and a lot of great reporting has taken down the Supreme Court, previously one of the few institutions that still had some respect. And so I deeply believe in that kind of accountability reporting, and yet, I have to believe that does erode faith in institutions, including in the media, in a way that probably overall is unhelpful and probably does lead to these people who just the nihilism, people who reject everything and end up storming the Capitol or voting for Wilders or whatever it may be. So, I don't really know how to square that circle, except perhaps, just to do, in addition to that accountability journalism, to also, acknowledge that other side of the picture where things are, policies are kind of working and making a difference. And, we have had some incredible instances of progress, and, teen births have dropped 70% since 1991. And Brad Wilcox tomorrow will talk about the proportion of children raised in two-parent households going up, not down. And so, is there an opportunity maybe to talk about some occasions where institutions are actually working? The military, it always strikes me that, like for Native American communities around the country, basically every institution has failed Native American communities. And you look at the high school graduation rate for Bureau of Indian Education schools, it's 53%. That is just this huge scandal. And the one institution that still provides upward mobility has been the US military. If you go in Navajo Nation, military is like one thing that still helps. And I wonder if we can do.
I did just read about Native Americans in the military for tablet, actually.
So maybe, maybe there's more that we can do a lot, times when institutions work, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, all I'd add, that one reason from the New York Times and then another newspaper to what I'm doing now is because I do think that the crisis of trust at the state and local level is really, really profound. I think there is a difference between covering things for like a global publication like the New York Times or the Atlantic, Washington Post, and then doing it for a community. And so we're literally right now talking about expanding into some local news markets because right now we're mostly state government. And one of the things we've talked about is that balance, right? Like, of course, we're in this business in part because we want to hold the powerful accountable. All I would say, and that you can't sacrifice that, all I would say, though, is that you have to also surround it with, news that brings communities together, especially at the local level. Some solutions journalism, which, as David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg have described it, it's not like panacea journalism, but it's more like covering actual interventions or volunteer movements or social science things or government policies that are working and show why it hasn't worked elsewhere, but it's worked here because that sort of thing. And, there's really no substitute for covering things with kind of deep knowledge and nuance. And I think one of the crises we have in local news, like local news reporters have been, there's still some left, gems of their communities, pillars of their communities. And unfortunately, over the last 30 years, we saw all that human capital not invested in or disinvested in, and then ultimately washed out of our, if you actually look at the number of former journalists at this point, they may, at the local level, they probably outnumber the number of journalists. And, is there a way that those former journalists, many of whom have gone on to interesting things in, civic life, but, that human capital was underinvested in. And so I think we have to do more to kind of bring that back. And then those are the voices that actually are more likely to earn trust. Just the final thing, we see Pew or Gallup saying only 9% of people trust the media. And there's no good news there, except that local news is more trusted. Like when people are thinking about 24/7 cable, the trust is very low. But when they are asked about news in their community, you get up to 40% or so, saying, well, at least I'm trusting the news I get in my community. The problem is that so many communities don't have local news anymore.
Danielle, that's Bell Sawhill. There's a strict formula, Daniel. Sorry, we're going to get there.
Is this on?
Yes, ma'am.
So, Nick, you talked a lot about the dysfunction in politics, and especially when you had your brief 10 minutes with it. And I think a lot of us, and I ask this out of curiosity, not to be partisan, a lot of us are just mystified about why the establishment Republicans, the leaders of the Republican Party, have gone and supported Trump as much as they have, and as in what seems to an outside observer as enthusiastically as they have. And so I'm just interested in their motivation, because you would think that if they really, really believe that moving the country into a more conservative direction, maybe the means justifies the ends justify the means, or are they really just after power, or are they so socially isolated themselves that they don't see a larger picture here? I mean, I'm really just genuinely mystified about what's going on there, because it makes obviously a huge difference in where we are as a country.
Well, Bill, I think you and a lot of folks here in Washington may have better insights into this. But I do think, and my 10 minutes in politics did kind of confirm it, that, politics is about compromises, and you start with small compromises and then end up with bigger compromises. And you certainly want to win your party nomination to get reelected. And when you began to get people being challenged in primaries, then I think that had a real impact in having Republicans move further to the right and be more likely to embrace Trump, and sense that that's where the voters were, and people rushed to get in front of where they thought the voters were. And there's always been a certain element of that in politics. I think it's been particularly pronounced with the Republican Party over the last 5 years or so, or more, but 10 years, but really since the Tea Party, I guess. But it's not exclusively the Republican Party, and I saw elements of this just when I was running, and I'm trying to extract money from Democratic donors, and so I'm making moral compromises about the things that I'm telling groups of donors. And so, I'm not, when I talk about Portland, I'm not immediately saying, yeah, we really screwed up. This is, this is our problem, and it's true up and down the West Coast. I'm giving, I'm talking about individual problems, and I would argue that I handled those compromises rather better than a lot of Republicans on the Hill have handled it. But it is a question of the degree of compromises that people make, and I think people just, especially became desperate to stay relevant, to avoid being primaried, to have influence, and once you start convincing yourself of that, it's a very slippery slope. That's my take, but I think you guys will have a much more sophisticated view of that.
It's helpful. Maybe Matt Lewis, you want to go next? You got one, especially on that Trump question. You may want to. You've seen a few things.
What he said, I'm with him on that. I think it's a combination of variables, but for the elites and the politicians and the influencers, I think it's just as much about ambition and survival as it is any of the other variables. But I wanted to ask you about journalism and whether you think that your brand of purpose-driven, morals-based journalism can survive in this media environment, like in a free market, or if it requires, subsidization. Is that the right word? Being subsidized, by philanthropists, foundations, or institutions like the Times.
So I think that on the one hand, I think there is room for this in a market-based environment. I I always felt like I was spending the New York Times' money and then generating, covering things that nobody cared about, and we're getting about, my mom was reading, and that was about it. But still, I do think that audiences do like the idea of some kind of a moral purpose in journalism and some kind of a moral connection with the author or the presenter or whatever it may be with the other side, some kind of a moral connection, that there is a moral force there. And so I think that there can be a model there. The problem tends to be that reporting is expensive, and that is really where I believe the value is. And so, especially international coverage, it is just so difficult to go and then, you go and spend the money and take risks, and then the audience disappears. I think it's harder to do it on those kind of topics. Domestically, I think it's more feasible. One of the things that I found really dispiriting was some years ago, the Gates Foundation gave a grant to ABC News to cover global health issues, basically. And ABC News did some really good reporting on malnutrition, on maternal mortality, a few other issues. And this was controversial within the nonprofit community, because why should the Gates Foundation be giving money to overpaid television journalists to basically do their job, rather than pay for services? But the coverage was very good, and so after a year, Gates Foundation went back to ABC News and said, okay, we want to renew the grant. And ABC said, we don't want to take your money, because when we run these important stories, nobody watches them and they switch the channel. And boy, I found that dispiriting. But, the title is Chasing Hope. I mean, I do believe that there are some ways of telling some of these stories in ways that do have connections with audiences and that can have an impact and bring about change. It's hard, but I think it can be done.
Right down the row. How about Miranda Kennedy? Fox.
I really agree with you about class and newsrooms, and I just wonder if you have any ideas for solutions for that, because I think newsrooms have had some success in creating a pipeline from other communities, but not from working class communities. And I wonder if you've thought about how to do that.
I think that what worked to build more diverse newsrooms in other contexts of diversity was real outrage and working hard to achieve it. And because there was a recognition that there were great benefits to our coverage. And I don't think that we think as much about the benefits of socioeconomic diversity. And I don't think we try nearly as hard to bring people from, working class folks into newsrooms. I think we just need to try a lot harder. And I guess I do think that in the backdrop, and Sewell kind of alluded to this, I do think that there is a certain amount of kind of intellectual arrogance among the educated class, and that one of the few prejudices that it is still acceptable to have is a prejudice among the college educated toward those who are not college educated. I think that, like all stereotypes, those of people who don't have a university degree are often invidious and unhelpful, and there are going to be questions about getting great writers and so on, but I do think that if we try harder, we can do better.
Jackie Combs, a columnist with the Los Angeles Times in DC.
That's sort of a good segue to what I wanted to ask you about just quickly. I am one of 9, but the only one who went to college, and it was because I was willing. I was in debt into my 30s, and I just really think it's gotten so much worse. There are 2 things: there's financial, certainly, but also where I grew up and in my world, there was no one saying you should go to college. And I gravitated there only because my late father, who died when I was very young, had been on the GI Bill, and he was the one person who said to me, "You will go to college." None of my other siblings had that influence because he died too young. And I really have tried all my life to think about how do we improve that? And it's only gotten worse, I think. And so sometimes I think national service might be the answer, both for giving you the exposure to other people from other places, but also maybe giving you an opportunity to make some money that you can just then put towards higher education. I'm just curious what you think about national service, because I'm sure you've thought about it much more deeply than I have.
I've thought about it partly in the context that that the military itself has been this great route of upward mobility for kids who don't go to college. But in America today, most kids who would benefit from it are not eligible for it because they have a criminal record, or they can't pass a drug test, or they can't pass the cognitive or physical fitness test. And so I've wondered, are the benefits of military service also available to some of those folks through some kind of a national service program? I think the evidence on those programs is somewhat mixed and depends on the program, and some of the programs have a pretty good evidentiary record, and some frankly don't. I think that a mandatory program would probably not fly, that if banning TikTok is difficult, then creating a national mandatory program for young people would be even more difficult. But I do think there are ways of funding more volunteer programs that would provide that escape from dysfunctional homes, provide support. What missions have done for the Mormon community, for young men in the Mormon community, is so good for those communities and for those young people. And now more women are going on missions. And so I do think that there are probably ways we can help cultivate some of that in some programs, as long as they are not mandatory. And I guess the other thing I would add is that there's been, and it may again go to this sort of the degree to which there's a presumption of being college educated among journalists, but there's a quite good, robust conversation about how we get more people into college and through college. There isn't nearly the discussion there should be about the fact that 1 in 7 kids still doesn't graduate from high school. And if you don't graduate from high school in 2024 in America, you are cooked. Your kids are cooked. And we've got to do a better job getting kids through high school. If they're not going to go to college, getting them some kind of vocational skills that can support them, and community service or training. There may be ways that can connect as well.
How about one more? Daniel Littman from Politico.
How worried are you about the U.S. going too far in the anti-China, mindset, where previously we might have been too open to trading with them, and now we've gone in the reverse. And in terms of also, like, after she leaves or dies, if we are still on this anti-China stance, like, does that hurt the chances of China, kind of pulling back in terms of maybe becoming more moderate after that happens, after he leaves the stage? Thank you.
I do worry about that in a couple of contexts. Like the FBI counterintelligence operations, I think there's been a tendency to go after Chinese Americans, especially in university settings, in ways that I think are just unacceptable and have been very unfair to the Chinese American community, and have led to Chinese scholars being more reluctant to do work in this country in ways that have hurt us. Probably more important I worry that sometimes in our concern about the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, for example, we take steps that actually increase the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And I think the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan was an example of something that did nothing to improve Taiwan security and actually increased the risk to Taiwan. And that I think that risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea is real, and that it's been very important that we build on our alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Australia in ways that we've, I think, done well. But that the provocations that we engage in that don't actually improve Taiwan security increase the risk of China actually engaging in a more dangerous action. I think that's exactly what happened in the aftermath of the Pelosi visit. So I do worry that some of the fears can be self-fulfilling.
What did you mean in the book when you said it's easier to mount a tiger than to dismount?
骑虎难下. Easy to 骑虎, get on the back of a tiger. 难下, hard to get off. And it's good Chinese saying that is exactly right.
So it's easy to get on.
Yeah. Well, maybe if it's a small tiger.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Yeah.